Ezekiel 33:3.
Welcome to today's Sabbath study. I titled this one New Year's Already? ? So what we're going to take a look at today is we'll take a look at New Year's in the Bible. We'll take a look at where we get our New Year's customs from today. We'll also take a look at the religion of Rome, because that's a big piece of the puzzle. You need to understand at least bits and pieces of what the Romans believed in order to understand what some of their customs and rituals were. So the agenda for today, we'll be taking a look at when is New Year's mentioned in the Bible. We'll take a look at what is the religion of Rome, and then we'll take a look at this character called Janus. So when is the New Year mentioned in the Bible? Let's start with that one. Exodus 12:1 and 2. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is the beginning of months for you. It shall be the first month of your year." So right there, you can tell whatever we're talking about, whatever month this is in Exodus 12, there's the new year. So we just have to figure out what exactly we're talking about here. Let's look at the whole thing in context. Exodus 12:1 to 12. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is the beginning of months for you. It shall be the first month of your year. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month, each man must select a lamb for his family, one per household. If the household is too small for a whole lamb, they are to share with the nearest neighbor based on the number of people and apportion the lamb accordingly. Your lamb must be an unblemished year-old male, and you must take it from the sheep or goats. You must keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of the houses where they eat the lambs." It's continued here. "They are to eat the meat that night, roasted over the fire, along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of the meat raw or cooked in boiling water, but only roasted over the fire. Its head and legs and inner parts. Do not leave any of it until morning. Before the morning, you must burn up any part that is left over. This is how you are to eat it. You must be fully dressed for travel, with your sandals on your feet and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that night, I will pass through the land of Egypt, and I will strike down every firstborn male, both man and beast, and I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood of the houses where you are staying will distinguish them. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will fall on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So we can see in Exodus here, we're seeing that this context of what's the new year is obviously connected to the Passover, because we can see the Passover feast, we can see the lamb, we can see the instructions of how to cook the lamb, and we can see that the instructions here were basically preparing the people for some kind of judgment that was going to be executed against Egypt. And it wasn't against any specific god in Egypt, it was every single god of Egypt. Keep that in mind. So the Lord in the Bible is adamantly against every single god in Egypt. The details of the Passover. On the 10th day of the first month, each household would select an unblemished year-old lamb. We saw that in Exodus 12:3. On the 14th day of the month, the lamb was sacrificed at twilight in front of the congregation. That's Exodus 12:6. So 10th day of the first month of the year, you're choosing the lamb. 14th day of the first month of the year at twilight, you're sacrificing the lamb in front of the congregation. The blood of the lamb was to be put around the doorways of the houses the lamb was eaten. So you might have seen, actually, it's a Hebrew letter. You'll see, I think it's hay, actually. They draw this, or tau. They draw around the doorposts, basically blood going down the left, the right, and the top, and it makes a Hebrew letter. The lamb has to be eaten entirely and cooked in fire, not boiled in water. Exodus 12:9. You are supposed to be dressed for travel with your sandals on and staff ready. Now, when you read that, you're probably wondering why they have to be dressed for travel. Remember, at this point of time, they're in Egypt. And this was the final scene in Egypt before Moses actually leaves Egypt with his people. So when they had this Passover meal, they were eating it quickly, because right after this, of course, Pharaoh and the people of Egypt were going to wake up to a bunch of dead children and animals. So they had to leave quickly. That's why their sandals were on their feet and they were dressed for travel. So one of the customs of Passover is you're supposed to be dressed for travel. So let's look at this. Exodus 12:1 and Exodus 12:11. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month is the beginning of months for you. It shall be the first month of your year. Okay, so we understand that the new year is being communicated in Exodus 12:1. Exodus 12:11. This is how you are to eat it. You must be fully dressed for your travel, with your sandals on your feet and your staff in hand. You are to eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So we know that the new year for the Jews falls in the same month as the Passover. If we figure out the month of the Passover, we also know the month of the new year. So on the 10th day of the first month, they select the lamb. On the 14th day at twilight, they sacrifice the lamb. So we just have to figure out what the first month is, and then we know what the new year is. The first month of the year was during the month of Passover. If we take a look here at the list of Hebrew months. So if you see, it says before exile, after exile. So remember I told you that some of the years had changed in names? So if you look at the first month was called Abib. And then after they were exiled, it was changed to Nisan. So then we have to look for the month of Abib Nisan. If we take a look at this wheel, we can see here are the 9 biblical holy days, and we can see that Passover, the orange one, it falls in the month of Nisan. So if we look, we see Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they both fall in the month of Nisan because the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as you know, starts with the Passover. So the month of Nisan, or Abib, depends on what calendar you're looking at, was the first month of the year. So when we take a look at Nisan, we can see that Nisan, it overlaps with March, April. As a matter of fact, the Passover for 2021 is going to be Saturday, March 27th. So basically, if we take the two calendars, do a little bit of work because, of course, they don't perfectly overlap, we just have to find out when the first day of Nisan was, and the first day of Nisan is going to be the first day of the year, which is likely going to be sometime in March. When did we start to, so actually, you know what, we can work it out. I want to take the time. So if the Passover is on Saturday, March the 27th, well, we know that on the 14th day is when they were doing the sacrifice. So basically, if we subtract 14 from that, we can figure out what the first day of the year is. So that's how you would figure out the first day of the year. So when did we start to celebrate the new year in January? This is from newworldencyclopedia.org. This is an article on New Year's Day. It reads, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, instituted the concept of celebrating the new year in 2000 BC. Okay, so the first time now this wasn't based on January, but this was just celebrating the new year in general. So the first New Year celebration started in 2000 BC in Mesopotamia. This celebration took place around the time of the vernal equinox in mid-March. So at this point, we can see what the Bible says in regards to what's the start of the year. That's when people used to celebrate the new year, because we can see it's mid-March, and mid-March is fairly close, especially if you're going by a solar calendar, with what the Hebrews were looking at in regards to what the new year was. The early Roman calendar consisted of 10 months. So we have 12 months now, but we had 10 months back in the day. January and February were added later. Those months didn't exist. It was just like a blackout. And then the Romans had designated March 1st as the first day of the year. So it wasn't just the people living in Iraq and Mesopotamia. The Roman Empire had designated March 1st as the first day of the year, which is once again pretty close to the Hebrew calendar because, again, it's falling at the vernal equinox. Then in pre-Christian Rome, under the Julian Calendar, the day was dedicated to Janus, god of gateways and beginnings, for whom January is also named. The January calends came to be celebrated as the new year after it became the day for inaugurating new councils. Romans had long dated their years by these consulships rather than sequentially. I'm just going to make a point. Roman rulers actually changed what the dates were so they could increase their reign. So our calendar in regards to trying to calculate time is kind of difficult because there were Roman rulers who wanted to continue in office, and what they would do is they would just change time and actually rule for additional years, months and sometimes additional years. So in regards to Romans, there was not much focus so much on time. The time wasn't the focus of the calendar. It was mainly just looking at these different Roman councils and different bodies of leaders. This is what they were really measuring. That's all they cared about. In 153 BC, they aligned this dating with the calendar, making the calends of January the first day of the new year. Still, private and religious celebrations at March, New Year, continued for some time. So the whole reason that the New Year was moved to January was because they started to do their inaugurations in January. That was the whole reason for the change. And when I explained the god Janus, it's going to make more sense why they made a connection between Janus, new councils, and a new year. There is a logical reason. And you'll notice here that not everyone adopted the new year in January. I mean, if you're a farmer, it doesn't make much sense to start the year in January when everything's melting in the spring in March. So the March New Year was more aimed towards agricultural farmers, not towards people just living within the Roman state. So a lot of people kept the March New Year's. As a matter of fact, the Romans, they made this custom called April Fools. So anyone who didn't accept the idea that January was the new year was called the April Fool. The first January New Year. January 1st became the new year when Rome used the date to inaugurate new councils, which occurred in 153 BC. The name of the month of January came from the Roman god Janus. Rome used to celebrate the new year on March 1st, and many Romans continue to celebrate the new year in March. We're going to now take a look at some of the history of Rome. We're going to look at Rome in its very, very early days, and we're going to walk through all of its stages at a high level, just to give you an idea of some of the major players and how exactly they formed their religion. We're going to start first with Latium. That's 1000 BC to 600 BC. So this is where you get words like Latin. Latium, 1000 BC to 600 BC. You can take a look at it right here. Here's an old map. So obviously we're looking around the Italy area. We're going to start first with the story of Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus. Romulus is where you get the name Rome from. He was the founder of Rome. In Roman mythology, Romulus and his twin brother Remus were the founders of the city of Rome. They were the children of Rhea Silvia and Mars, or in some variations, the demigod hero Hercules. So Mars, obviously, we must be talking about a deity. Romulus and Remus were related to Aeneas through their mother's father, Numitor. Numitor was a king of Alba Longa, an ancient city of Latium in central Italy, and father to Rhea Silvia. So I highlighted that because here we can see in this situation, Rhea Silvia is the daughter and wife of Mars, or Numitor in this case. Before Romulus and Remus's conception, Numitor's reign was usurped by Numitor's younger brother, Amlius. Amlius inherited control over Alba Longa's treasury, with which he was able to dethrone Numitor and become king. Amulius wished to avoid any conflict of power. He killed Numitor's male heirs and forced Rhea Silvia to become a Vestal virgin. So in Rome, this is actually where the nuns come from. The whole concept of a nun is a Vestal virgin. There is nothing biblically to support what a nun is. This is where it came from. So the Vestal virgins, basically what happened was when all the male heirs were killed, the women had to take the place of the men. And this was basically a move by Numitor to protect his own reign. Vestal virgins were priestesses of Vesta, a patron goddess of the hearth. So when you understand Roman religion, which we're going to cover in a little bit, the Romans didn't just deify things like the planets, the stars, the constellations. The Romans were deifying natural forces. So when they looked at a hearth, right, like a fireplace inside of the house, they believed that there was a god over the hearth, or in this case, a goddess over the hearth. And so the Romans were worshiping all kinds of different things, wind, water, whatever, because they were trying to basically show these gods respect so they would aid them in whatever they were doing. So obviously the hearth god was really important because when it got cold out, the hearth goddess was the one that heated your home. They were charged with keeping a sacred fire that was never to be extinguished and to take vows of chastity. Again, the vows of chastity, you can see in the Bible, there's nowhere saying that the priest had to be celibate. As a matter of fact, Aaron had a wife, and he was the first priest of Israel. That was Leviticus and the Levites. So there's absolutely no reason why in the Christian movement you see anyone practicing these vows of chastity, unless, of course, they're just not getting married. There is much debate and variations as to whom the father of Romulus and Remus was. So there's different myths. Some myths claim that Mars appeared and lay with Rhea Silvia. Other myths attest that the demigod hero Hercules was her partner. However, the author Livy claims that Rhea Silvia was in fact raped by an unknown man, but blamed her pregnancy on divine conception. Remember that one, because that'll come up later. In either case, Rhea Silvia was discovered to be pregnant and gave birth to her sons. It was custom that any Vestal virgin betraying her vows of celibacy was condemned to death. The most common death sentence was to be buried alive. However, King Amalius, fearing that the wrath of the paternal god Mars or Hercules, he did not wish to directly stain his hands with the mother's and children's blood. So King Amalius imprisoned Rhea Silvia and ordered the twins, Romulus and Remus, death by means of live burial, exposure, or being thrown into the Tiber River. So if you know the story of Romulus and Remus, their death sentence was through the Tiber River. Basically, the idea was this. The king thought, well, Mars or Hercules is going to be harsh with me if I have these children's blood on my hand. So what I'll do is I'll leave it up to nature. I'll leave it up to the elements. So I'll send these babies onto a stream on the Tiber River, and if nature kills them, well, that's not my fault. That was his perspective. Then we get to the story of the she-wolf, Lupa. This is 100 BC to 44 BC where we see this fresco. Romulus and Remus went down to the Tiber River and then were suckled by a she-wolf, Lupa. So basically these babies, these two twins, they went down the stream in this mythology, and then once they obviously exited out of their little, I guess, handbasket, kind of like the Moses story, the story was just that they were basically taken care of by a she-wolf, and the Romans called these Lupas. The twins were then adopted by a shepherd, and his wife Faustulus, adopted by a shepherd, and this was Faustulus and Acca Laurentia. So after the wolf raised these two children for a bit, they were then adopted by a shepherd. As the twins grew older, they encountered shepherds of King Amlius, and after an argument, Remus was taken. So these two brothers, they become shepherds. This king, he also has shepherds. The two kind of come into contact with each other, not the king, but the shepherds of the king, and they come into an argument. The argument ends up with these shepherds of the king taking Remus away, and Romulus is left behind. Then Romulus frees his brother, and in the process, he kills King Amlius. The twins reinstated their father as king and looked to found their own land. So the people, they said, hey, this can be your land right here, after they basically took the land back from King Amalius, because King Amalius is dead now. But what the twins did was they reinstated their father, so Nemeter. The twins fought against each other, and eventually Remus died, and Rome was founded on April 21st, 753 BC. So Romulus, Rome, this was April 21st, 753 BC. The story was basically this. There's different accounts as to how Remus died. In some of the accounts, they said that Remus and Romulus were fighting with each other because Remus had a hill, Romulus had a hill, and they were both fighting over their hills. That's one story. Another story was that when Romulus was building his city, he built a wall around his hill. And then when Remus was mocking him and tried to climb over it, he fell and killed himself. A couple different ways that happened, but it's unanimously agreed by scholars that when Remus died, however he died, that's when Rome was founded. So 753 BC is supposed to be the death of Remus and also the founding of Rome. So here's some of the images of Romulus and Remus, and obviously the shepherd finding these two babies being nursed by the Lupa. Here's another example. So the first king of Rome officially was Romulus. So Rome is named by Romulus, 715 BC to 673 BC. So 673 BC, this is when we saw that Rome was founded. Just making sure that I got that right. Sorry, 753 BC. Romulus was made into a god following his death. So if you take a look into the history books, you'll find that more than once in Rome, it wasn't just Romulus. Different Roman leaders, when they died, they came up with these different mythologies talking about how they would ascend to the heavens and become gods. Really interesting because we have this in the Bible too. In the Bible, going all the way back to King Nimrod. When King Nimrod died, Nimrod himself was said to ascend to the heavens. As a matter of fact, most children know two constellations in the sky. They know the Big Dipper, Little Dipper, but they also know the constellation Orion. The constellation Orion is where Nimrod was said to have ascended to, and many other people in history who had died and become deities were said to have ascended to that part of the sky as well. It's interesting in the Bible where it says, can you free yourself from the influences of Orion and take in the sweet influences of Pleiades? So in other words, what that communicates to me is don't adopt the Roman religion, because the Roman religion was definitely connected to the worship of Orion. We can take a look here. We see this god called Quirinius. In spite of his importance, little is known about Quirinius. He bears a similarity to Mars, and some believe that he is only another form of that deity. By the late Republic, he has identified completely with Romulus. So they came up with a deity called Quirinius, and he was part of their triad. The Romans had a triad. This is likely where you get the word Trinity from, because Trinity is found nowhere in the Bible. You can see what they did was that when Romulus died, they made him part of their triad. And the part of the triad was they overlapped him with this god that was very familiar to Mars, which was Quirinius. His name was the name under which the immortalized Romulus was worshipped, and his festival fell on the same date that Romulus was said to have ascended to the gods, perhaps to assume the identity of Quirinius. He had a festival, the Quirinalia, on February the 17th. His temple on Quirnal was one of the oldest temples in Rome. So that would make sense. The Quirnal would be the oldest temple in Rome because it's named after who? Well, it has an association to the immortalized Romulus, and Romulus was the first king. Makes total sense. In the original religion of Rome, Romulus was deified as Quirinius, so an aspect of Mars, which is one of the oldest Roman temples. Then we have the second king of Rome. He might be even more famous, or at least at the same level. Numa Pompilius. Numa Pompilius, 715 to 653. So he's your second emperor, second king of Rome. Numa Pompilius was a Sabine. If you've heard of the Sabines before, the Sabines were just north of Rome. So if you look at the map here, you can see this area here, Latnia, which eventually became Rome. North of Rome is where the Sabines were. So our second king is a Sabine. This is important because the Sabines had different gods. He was of Sabine origin, and many of Rome's most important and religious political institutions are attributed to him. The Roman calendar. Numa was the one who came up with the first Roman calendar. The concept of the Vestal Virgins. So the Vestal Virgins, remember, when all the male heirs were killed, the females had to take the place. So we have a female cult here. The cult of Mars. He also instituted the cult of Jupiter and the cult of Romulus. Now, it shouldn't be surprising he instituted the cult of Romulus because Romulus was the king that preceded him. And if we take a look beneath here, it says the office of the Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex Maximus was later called the Pope. So if anyone Catholic says, well, Peter was the first Catholic Pope, that's baloney. There were popes going on way farther back in time. The popes were actually associated to something that had nothing to do with Christianity. If you were to say that Peter was the first Christian Pope, perhaps. Nothing written in the word, obviously. But if we're talking about the first pope, absolutely not. There were many Pontifex Maximuses, and we'll take a look at those later. Numa created the Temple of Janus Geminus. So remember, we're studying January. We're taking a look at New Year's. Numa had created the Temple of Janus, and the Temple of Janus is where we're getting this overlap with the word January. During times of peace, the doors of the temple would be open. During times of war, the doors would be closed. So the Romans were always at war, so it wasn't very often that the doors of the Temple of Janus were closed. Basically, the idea was when the doors were closed, peace was kept within. When the doors were opened, troops were allowed to flow inside and outside. That's why times of war, they were opened, closed during times of peace, because you weren't having soldiers going back and forth. Sorry? You said during the times of peace. Oh, so I have a typo on my screen. Okay. During the times of peace, the doors to the temple would be closed. During the times of war, the doors would be open. There's a typo. This is the Janus temple coin. If you take a look, this is from the Roman Republic. They didn't actually see what this temple looked like because this temple was destroyed long after we had any illustrations of it or really much left behind. Nero made a coin, and on Nero's coin, that's where we saw what the Temple of Janus looked like. So this is an example of the Temple of Janus with the gates closed. We know that it was Pompilius, the second king of Rome, who instituted the Temple of Janus. So sometime between Pompilius and then sometime between when Rome became the Roman Empire, which was 27 BC, it no longer stood. I think Augustus was one of the last people to see this temple, and Augustus was right at that crossing point where Rome became the Roman Empire. The Temple of Janus only closed 3 times in history. That means that Rome was always at war. So under King Numa, 673 BC, he was the second king of Rome. That was the first time that the doors had closed. So obviously, it must have started off with war. At the end of the Second Punic War, 201 BC. So the Punic Wars, if you ever hear about the Punic Wars, the Punics are the Canaanites. In the history books, they don't call Canaanites Canaanites typically. They just call them Canaanites in the Bible. In the history books, they call them the Punics. Sometimes you'll see Carthage, because Carthage were the Phoenicians and the Phoenicians were the Punics. Here are the different words you'll find over time used for the Canaanites. Canaanites were called Canaanites, they were called Phoenicians, and they were called Punics. Those are the most common names. Under Augustus Caesar was the third close. So you can see, like, for most of the time, Rome was a nation, or Rome was an empire. Rome was just constantly sending troops out of their gates to basically keep conquering. So Rome was always at war. From 600 BC to 27 AD, we have the Roman Republic. So now this Latium, no more. Now it's actually called Rome. Rome didn't expand outside the Italian peninsula until the 3rd century. So while Rome was starting their expansion in the 6th century, they actually didn't leave outside of what we would call Italy today until the 3rd century. Next, we have Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is 100 BC to 44 BC. He was a Roman general and statesman who played a critical role in the events that led to the demise of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. So previously, Rome was a republic. That's the time he was living in. And then in 27 BC, we had the Roman Empire under Augustus Caesar. So this was after Julius. Assuming control of government, Caesar began a program of social and governmental reforms, including the creation of the Julian Calendar. Okay, so the first Roman calendar came from the second king of Rome, so King Pompilius. And now we have the third calendar, or sorry, now we have the second calendar, which is the Julian calendar. As we know, we have a third calendar for Rome because we're on that calendar today. It's called the Gregorian calendar, and that was under, I believe, Pope Gregory. So we're looking around 1500s. On Ides of March, that's the 15th of 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by a group of rebellious senators and led by Brutus and Cassius, who stabbed him to death. So basically, there's a lot of details to the story of Julius Caesar. There was a civil war. He was able to basically gain all of his power following the civil war, but then eventually his power was taken for him when he was assassinated. So Julius Caesar, he didn't really create the Roman Empire, but he started those early steps. But who created the Roman Empire was really his great-nephew. So in the last bullet, we can see Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian, later known as Augustus, rose to sole power after defeating opponents in a civil war. So like Julius Caesar, Augustus, he was in a civil war, also victorious, and his birth name was actually Octavian. Augustus isn't a name. Augustus is actually a title. So when you look at the month of August and you're like, oh, August, it's after Augustus. Yeah, that's true. But Augustus was a religious title. It denoted the fact that he wasn't just an empire, or sorry, not just an emperor that was ruling, but he was also a religious figurehead. So there was a lot of similarities to what you would call the Pope and what I see going on with this title Augustus. Roman conquest of the Greeks. So remember, we had that turnover where first it goes Babylon, then Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. The Roman era of Greek history began with the Corinthian defeat in the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC. So this is where you start to see Rome really starting to dig their claws in and start to take power away from the Greeks. And at this point, the Greek Empire was ruling the world. The definitive Roman occupation of the Greek world was established after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, in which Augustus defeated Cleopatra VII. So this is Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. So a lot of people are quite familiar with Cleopatra. That's that Cleopatra. So Augustus defeated Cleopatra, the Greek polemic queen of Egypt. Roman general Mark Antony conquered Alexandria, 30 BC, the last of the great last city of Hellenistic Greece. So the Greeks, remember Greeks had this place called Heliopolis. Greeks had their Greek god Helios and a whole pantheon of different gods. They were called the Hellenists. Of course, Hellenists and Helios, that all points us back to the sun. We can see that the last stance of the Greeks was basically with Alexandria. After this, That was the end of the Greek Empire, and then we move into the Roman Empire, because after 30 BC and 27 BC is when we start the next empire, which is the Roman Empire. So Greek is out, Roman is now in. Roman Empire lasted from 27 BC to around 476 AD, when Rome split. On the scene, we've got Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was 63 BC to 14 BC. So obviously, after the birth of Christ, who was in charge? Well, Caesar Augustus. As a matter of fact, give to Caesar what is owed to Caesar. We see that in Matthew, Mark, we see that in the Gospels. So if we take a look, during the times of Christ, obviously depending on how old he was, the Caesar that was in power could have been Augustus, or it could have been the next Caesar in line. Caesar Augustus made Julius Caesar into a deity and started the lineage of Caesars with him. So Augustus closing the Temple of Janus. So remember, there were 3 times the Temple of Janus had closed. As soon as Rome became Rome, Roman Empire in 27 BC with Augustus Caesar in charge, that's the 3rd time that the Temple of Janus was closed. So here's an image of Augustus Caesar, and you can see him inside of the Temple of Janus. If you look in the far back there, you can see Cleopatra's Needle, which is an obelisk that came from Egypt. You can even see the Egyptian hieroglyphics on it. Augustus also styled himself as Imperator Caesar Divi Filius, which means Commander Caesar, son of the deified one. Why would he be son of the deified one? Well, because he deified Julius Caesar. So he's the son of Julius Caesar. So the Caesars were what? They were sons of God. With this title, he boasted his familial link to the deified Julius Caesar, and the use of the imperator signified a permanent link to the Roman tradition of victory. He transformed Caesar, a cognomen is like a nickname, for one branch of the Julian family into a new family line that began with him. Since Julius Caesar was a god, Augustus was stylized as the son of God. Now we're going to go and take a look at the gods of Rome. By looking at the gods of Rome, it's going to give us a better idea in regards to how some of their worship worked, and we'll also see some overlaps with the Bible as well. While this polytheism certainly offended monotheistic Christians, it tells us much about the Romans and their gods. The Roman Pantheon was a celestial bureaucracy with major and minor divinities overseeing human life in fine detail. The Roman belief was that every human action was guided by an expert divinity. Even the most mundane aspects of human life thus became suffused with divinity. It is not possible to discuss the almost infinite number of gods of the Roman people. There are simply too many. Encyclopedia.com, Gods of the Roman People. The Romans personified the planets as gods and the natural forces, amongst other things. There are 5 planets visible with the eyes and the sun and moon to give you the 7 days of the week. So our days of the week are based on the 5 visible planets and the sun and the moon. So we start off with the Roman god Dies Soles. Dies Soles, day of the sun. So Sol was a sun god. And at that time, they had considered that the sun was a planet. Dies Lunae, the day of the moon. So the Romans had a goddess, Luna, you get the moon. Marti is coming from Mars, the day of Mars. So Tuesday was associated to Mars. Dies Mercurii, the day of Mercury. The Romans also had a god called Mercury. The Egyptians called this god Thoth. Dies Jovis, Jovis, or Jupiter, the day of Jupiter. This was the chief god of the Roman Pantheon. As a matter of fact, the chief god of the Roman Pantheon was consistent from the very start of Rome, going all the way back to Romulus and Remus and the first institution of gods, moving all the way forward to basically where they stopped worshiping Jupiter. So this carried on basically until they had Christianized Rome. So this was their chief god, Jupiter, the king of the gods, Zeus. Dii Veneris, the day of Venus. This was Aphrodite as well to the Greeks. Dii Saturni, the day of Saturn, or who the Greeks called Kronos. So each day of the week, instead of being numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what the Jews were doing up until that time was they were just saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then once they would reach the 6th day, they would say preparation day. 7th day would be the Sabbath. And so here what we're seeing is we're seeing that instead of numbering the days, we're now seeing names applied to the days, and each day of the week is associated to a planet, which means each day of the week is associated to the tutelage of a god. There were also the Sabine gods. If you know Rome's history, Rome was conquering and expanding over its history. I mean, the Sabines were some of the earliest gods in Rome because Sabines were just north of, obviously, Rome. But when the Greeks were conquered, the Romans took in many of the Greek gods. Rome had this habit of every time it would conquer a nation, it would allow that nation to continue to worship those gods because the Romans were smart. They knew if we try to force these people to stop worshiping their gods, some of them are going to kill themselves because they are absolutely, adamantly opposed to getting rid of their old household gods. So the Romans said, okay, you can keep your other gods, but with your other gods, you're going to see these ones as the chief gods. And I'll show you the chief gods in just a moment. But these are some of the gods that came from other nations. So the Sabine gods, for example, we see the name Minerva. Minerva might be one you recognize. Minerva is usually shown as an owl. As a matter of fact, I was in the Florida airport and I saw that the jackets of the security guards have the Minerva owl on them. There's Saturn. Saturn should be one you'd recognize. Fortuna. There's a song called O Fortuna. Now you know where the Fortuna part comes from. Sol, like di soles. So there's your sun god. Luna, Vulcan might be another one you're familiar with. As a matter of fact, if you lived in Rome and you had a stove, you had to pay a tax to Vulcan. So every year you had to give money to the Romans to pay for the fact that you had a fireplace. Another one would be Diana. Diana was also, I think, known as Diana Lucifera. That's where the name Lucifer came from. The Romans also had gods, and excuse my pronunciation, it's called lectisternium. It's the banquet for the gods. So basically all the gods were seated around a table. You'll see pictures of all these different gods basically laid on a couch at a table. These are groupings of 12. So they come in pairs. So we've got Jupiter and Juno. Those are a pair. They're consorts. From my research, these pairs actually represent different aspects. So Jupiter and Juno, one was male, one was female, but the argument was that Juno was just the female aspect of Jupiter. So when you were looking at Juno, you could see a lot of things that would remind you of Jupiter. The same thing could be said about Neptune and Minerva, Mars and Venus, Apollo and Diana, Vulcan and Vesta, Mercury and Ceres. As a matter of fact, Ceres is where you get the word cereal. She was an agricultural god. There's another group called Deconcentis. So this is Varro's 12 deities. Varro uses the name Deconcentis for 12 deities whose gilded images stood in the Forum. The Forum in Rome was basically an area where they would have this open place where they would have their gods where everyone could see. These were also placed in 6 male-female pairs. Although individual names are not listed, they are assumed to be the deities of the Lecternium. So this last list we just looked at here with these groupings of 12 and the 6 and 6, it was believed that Deconcentis was actually these 6 and 6, but they can't confirm it. What they did notice though is the order was a little bit different. Their pairing was different. It lists the same 12 deities by name, though in a different order from that of Livy. So Juno and Jupiter weren't together. Here we see Juno and Vesta, Minerva and Ceres, Diana and Venus, Mars, Mercurius, Jove, Neptunius, etc. So again, order's different. But what you'll notice here is that the gods Saturn and Uranus, known to the Greeks as Uranus, are missing. The reason why that's a big deal is because typically when you're dealing with Uranus or any gods that were associated to Uranus, they called these the Uranic deities. A Uranic deity means that it is a sky god. If you ever see the word Uranic, it means a sky god. And there were lots of different sky gods. If you see something called a Chthonic deity, Chthonic means it's an underworld deity. So you had a god above and you had a god below, or a god above and a goddess below, or whatever configuration it was. But the ones above were called Uranic. The ones below were called Chthonic. There was also the Deselecti. These were 20 principal gods. So Varro recorded the gods Janus, Jupiter, Saturn, Genusa, Mercury, etc. So here we can see, here's Janus. Janus fits in the list of Deselecti. So we can't tell exactly how old Janus is, but we can tell that it must go back at least to the second king of Rome, because that's when we see the Temple of Janus first come to fruition. When I did some research into Janus, Janus is actually an older deity. There's an older deity that is associated to ships and boats, and it would make a lot of sense why that would be, because when you take a look who the Romans were battling with, the Phoenicians were known as being on the sea, and it's quite likely the Phoenicians were giving some influence to the Romans and their gods. Because keep in mind, when the Romans conquered the Greeks, the Romans took some of the Greek gods. Well, the Greek gods, where did they come from? Well, from the Phoenicians, which were the Persians. And so each nation that you would see conquer another nation, you could see familiar gods because they were picking up a lot of the gods that were coming out of Babylon as Babylon was being conquered by their nations. So as Babylon was conquered by the Persians grabbed some of Babylon's gods. As the Persians were conquered by the Greeks grabbed some of the Persians' gods, which were some of the gods from Babylon. And then the last one in line were the Romans. And now you can see exactly why there's so many similarities between these different gods. In Rome, there was a priesthood. So this is the priesthood before Christianity, and this is where you get the word pope from. The priesthood in Rome were called the flamens. The flamens were the priests. The chief priest was called the flamen dialis. There was also someone called the rex sacrorum, and then there was the Pontifex Maximus, which today we call the Pope. This term was translated from Pontifex Maximus, which is still used but not so much, and it was changed into the Bishop of Rome. A distinctly religious office under the early Roman Republic, it gradually became politicized until, beginning with Augustus, it was subsumed into the position of emperor in the Roman imperial period. So this term here that we see, Pontifex Maximus, it actually applied to the first Roman Caesar, Augustus. So Augustus was the first pope, at least the first pope of the Roman Empire. There was obviously Pontifex Maximus prior to the Roman Empire when it was the Roman Republic. Flamens. So the flamens were the priests. A flamen was a priest of the ancient Roman religion who was assigned to one of the 18 deities with the official cults during the Roman Republic. Okay, well, 18 cults, you've got a lot of different people worshiping a lot of different things. The most important three were the flamen majores, which are the major priests, who served the important Roman gods Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus. So Quirinus we already covered. Quirinus is who? That's Romulus deified. And then we said that Mars, Quirinus was supposed to be the other aspect of Mars. So if Mars was supposed to be sun, Quirinus would be like a moon. The remaining 12 were the flamen minori, also known as the lesser priests. So they had major priests and they had minor priests. And the major priests specifically looked after their chief triad, and their chief triad were 3 gods. And then the minor priests were the ones looking after these other gods. And then during the imperial era, the cult of a deified emperor, a divus, also had a flamen. So as you would see these different Roman leaders die, the Roman leaders would die, they would become these deified, they would ascend to the heaven, become these deified emperors, and then at that point, they would have a flamen assigned to them too. So there'd be a priest assigned for each god that would be kind of worshipped. So the lesser priests, the flamen minores, there's 12 minor gods. 12 minor gods that were worshipped by the lesser priests were Carmentis, Ceres, Thalcer, Flora, Phryna, Palatia, Pomona, Portunus. Now, this is the other name for Janus right here. Portunus is likely where Janus came from. And you see the word port there, and port reminds you of boats. Now, Portunus was a god of gateways. Basically, when you would see boats come in and out of harbor, they would be coming in and out of the port. That had to do with Portunus. And Portunus was this god that was allowing basically ships in and ships out, giving them safe passage to where they were going and safe passage return. You can see how this overlapped with Janus shortly, because Janus is also a god of gateways. The only part we're missing was the water aspect. They also had Vulcan, Volturnus, and then 2 that were unknown. They knew there were 12 total, but they were missing 2 names. Now, this is when we start to get to the Roman Triad. And Roman Triad is likely where we have this overlap in the Bible with the word Trinity. If you search the Bible, you will not find the word Trinity in there. That is a term that was injected over top of the text. It's not a term in the Bible. It likely came from here. So this is the archaic Roman Triad. I think this is where they got Trinity from, because like I said, since I can see there was a Trinity in Asia and it came from the Oriental religions that came from Babylon, and there's an overlap between the Oriental religions in Babylon and Rome, it makes a lot of sense that this is where the Trinity came from. So Jupiter was the chief deity of this Trinity or triad. Mars and then Cornelius were the other two. So these were the three main Roman gods. You could worship other gods, but you had to give worship to these gods. So when the Romans had their different big state celebrations, different feasts, different festivals, these were the gods that were being honored. These were the gods that are being honored by the state. You could honor your own gods at your home, but the state wasn't going to honor your gods with you. The Major Triad. The Major Triad consisted of 15 flamens that would serve the archaic Roman triad. So that was those three gods, Jupiter, Cornelius, and Mars. Flamens were forbidden to touch metal, ride a horse, or see a corpse. Flamens were selected by the Pontifex Maximus. So of course we saw the Pontifex Maximus during the times of Augustus Caesar was Augustus Caesar. So guess who chose who the flamens were? Well, at that point it was the Caesar. So the Caesar was choosing the priests. So of course when we looked at Cornelius, we saw that Cornelius was identified with Romulus. And so I just showed here that with the major priests in the archaic Roman triad, Cornelius is also Romulus deified, just reminding you that this is supposed to be a man. Then what happened later was a replacement. It was called the Capitoline Trinity or the Capitoline Triad. So of course, you know that in Rome, you've got Capitoline Hill. Capitoline is actually based off the name Jupiter. So we'll cover this a little bit later, but the word capital and capital like money, they're actually connected by the Latin word caput. The Latin word caput means head, and the head was talking about Jupiter and Capitoline Hill, the head of the Trinity, the head of the triad. So we've got Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno. So we see that on one side here, Mars gets turned into Minerva and Cornelius gets turned into Juno. And then we have one final triad. This is called the Plebeian Triad. You might have heard the plebs if you've ever studied Rome and the history of Rome and its republic. So we have the Plebeian Triad, or it's also known as the Aventine Triad. This is 493 BC. So this was their last triad. This was Ceres. Ceres was an agricultural god. Now we're switching from a he to a she. And now we've got Liber and Libera. Liber is the word book. So we can tell here that Liber and Libera must have something to do with reading or wisdom. So if we take a look here, we've got the 7 hills of Rome. Quernal Hill, Viminal Hill, Capitoline Hill, Esquiline Hill. So Rome was known as the city of 7 hills. The one we're focusing on right now is Capitoline Hill. And Capitoline Hill has to do with Jupiter. Capitoline Hill used to be Mons Saturnius, dedicated to the god Saturn. So when we were studying Christmas, we found that people used to practice something called Saturnalia. And Saturnalia was on December the 25th in Rome. Well, at one time, there used to be a Temple of Saturn, and there used to be a Mons Saturnus. So this whole Capitoline Hill that's now dedicated to Jupiter, or was dedicated to Jupiter, it used to be dedicated to god Saturn. So we can see the Romans, they shuffled around gods quite a bit. I think what it had to do with was this. When you were living in a place that was like in the fields, you were a farmer, you were basically involved with agriculture, I think that the gods that went back to Saturn were more of the agricultural deities. I think that as we started to see Rome build up as an empire, and we started to see the production of cities and towns, I think they started to move away from their agricultural roots, and then all of a sudden they started to follow these sky gods. So instead of following these ground gods and agricultural deities that had to do with farming, they switched from looking down to looking up. That's my opinion. The Romans worshiped their gods from hills, just like the Canaanites. So as I mentioned, you look at the Canaanite gods and you look at the Roman gods, the Phoenician gods, which are the Canaanites, you can tell that they actually took some of them. So the Romans and their customs and traditions, they did overlap with the Canaanites in the Bible. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at Deuteronomy 12:2, I'm going to read a couple verses. We'll read these verses, we'll compare them to what we know about Rome, and we'll see how it applies. It says, Deuteronomy 12:2, you shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills, and on every green tree. Okay, so high mountains on the hills. What exactly did they do with the Roman triad? Capitoline Hill. Jeremiah 32:35. They built the high places of Baal that are in the valley of Ben Hinnom. to cause their sons and daughters to pass through the fire to Moloch, which I had not commanded them, nor it had entered my mind that they should do this abomination, to cause Judah to sin. Okay, so we can see there were high places where people worshiped gods, but specifically in Jeremiah, there were high places where people worshiped Baal. Were the Romans worshiping Baal? 2 Kings 23 and 5. Now remember, Baal is just the title, it's not a name. He did away with idolatrous priests, whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high places of the city of Judah and in the surrounding areas of Jerusalem, and also those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and the constellations, and all the host of heaven. So in the book of Kings, we can see that there were people that were doing what? They're worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars. They're burning incense to them, and they're doing it from high places. 2 Chronicles 28 and 25. In every city of Judah, he made high places to burn incense to other gods and provoke the Lord, the God of his fathers, to anger. Okay, so if we're trying to figure out, if we were to build a high place today, and we were to go worship some foreign god, how would the God of the Bible feel? 2 Chronicles says he is provoked to anger. So we can see already Rome had many gods, and we can see out of those many gods, Jupiter was the king of those gods. Jupiter was Zeus of the Greeks, and of course, the Romans conquered the Greeks, but we know that they had this god Jupiter long before they had conquered the Greeks. So they did not grab Zeus from the Greeks, they shared that god with the Greeks, but they already had that in their pantheon. Romans also had a series of household gods. So if the list of gods isn't big enough, I'm going to add some more. Lars Familias. Private and personal worship was an important aspect of religious practice of ancient Rome. Each home had a personal household god that kept things running smoothly at home, and in a sense, each household in ancient Rome was a temple to the gods. Each household had an altar or alarium, which the family members would offer prayers, perform rites, and interact with the household gods called Lars. Okay, so in addition to the triad of gods, so if you're living in Rome, you had to worship the triad of gods. If they told you to come out and basically come down to the, Capitoline Hill and perform a worship or stand there as a religious observance, you had to do so if you were in the area. In regards to your own gods, you could worship them on your own. Your family gods, the Lars Familias, you could worship them on your own. They're not going to be worshipped with the state gods. But these particular gods, they would be inside of the house. It'd kind of be like ancestral gods. You can think of these like ancestral spirits. These ancestral gods would have altars inside of the house, which was called a larium, and then they would sit inside the larium. So these little statues. So you had a household god. The Lars Familias, Latin for family guardians, were simply the household tutelary deities or guardian gods of the Roman religion. The singular form is Lar Familias. The terms are basically synonyms for Lars and were used interchangeably. Each Roman had a set of protective deities. So each household had the following, 4 things. The Lar or Lars of the household, whose shrine was a larium. So that's the ancestral god. The Penates, who guarded the storeroom of the innermost part of the house. So if you had some sacred stuff, let's say you had like a bunch of gold and you're storing it in your house, now you have a different god that watches over those possessions. A Vesta. A Vesta we heard about because the Vesta first came up when we saw that this king was basically slaughtering the other men in the kingdom to basically wipe out all the men. So we saw the Vestal virgins. Here we see that Vesta, whose sacred site in each house was the hearth. Okay, so your fireplace. So you had a god that would look after your stuff. You'd have a god that would look after your household and family members. You'd have a goddess that would look after the fireplace. And then you had the genius of the paterfamilias, or the head of the household. So the head of the house, the father of the house had a household god, which was called the genius. And the genius is actually based off of the word jinn. It's where we get the word genie. The chief deity, both capital and capitol, originate from the Latin word caput, meaning head. Capital comes from Capitoleum, which was the head name of the temple dedicated to Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Now you wonder, when you watch Transformers, Optimus Prime, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and then referred to the entire hill. Jupiter was the chief deity of Rome since the early times of Latium. He personified divine authority of Rome's highest offices, internal organization, and external relations. So what was Rome really? I mean, what was Jupiter really? Jupiter represented the government. When you were bowing allegiance to Jupiter, you were really bowing allegiance to the government because his representation was a personification of divine authority, office, internal organization, and relations. The Flamen Dialis was the high priest of Jupiter. So we talked about the Flamens. Well, Jupiter, the head of the triad, he had his own specific Flamen, and that was the Flamen Dialis. That was the chief priest. Here we can see a coin of Caesar Augustus. Now remember, who was the Pontifex Maximus? Well, at the time of Caesar Augustus, the reason he was called Augustus is because he was an emperor, but also a religious authority. So Caesar here is the Pope. So Augustus is denoting his religious power. If we take a look here, we'll notice on this coin from 27 BC to 1480, and this would coincide with obviously the time of the life of Christ, or at least a part of it, before he started his ministry. We can see here on this coin on one side, we've got Caesar Augustus. On the other side, we've got cornucopia. So we've got a goat, which is Capricorn, and Capricorn with the cornucopia. So if you take a look here, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a goat, and this goat is called Amathea. Amathea was actually the goat that nursed Zeus. On the right-hand side, there's supposed to be Zeus sitting there with Amathea. The story with Amathea is basically the cornucopia was the horn of Amathea's, or one of Amathea's horns. It's known as the horn of plenty because the horn would just keep refilling itself with food. So Zeus was able to take care of himself, obviously, residing with Amathea because he had this horn of plenty that just kept refilling itself. If we take a look, we're going to start to see where the Capricorn symbolism comes in. Because remember, this is all based on the zodiac. Remember all these gods we saw in Rome? There's always the sun, and the sun was always associated to traveling through the 12 houses of the zodiac. As a matter of fact, when we were looking back at De Consentis was likely based on the 12 zodiac houses. They just made them into 12 Roman gods. So if we take a look here, look at the winter solstice. Winter solstice is December the 21st. So December the 21st, we've got two constellations that are intersecting here. In the month of December, we've got Capricorn and we've also got Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the archer, Capricorn is the goat. So you would find in Rome that there were two gods being worshipped. Hence, there were two different, constellations that were overlapping here. And so some people are worshiping Juno in January, and some people are worshiping Janus in January. And it likely has to do with the split of these two astrological houses. If you take a look here on the right-hand side, this is De Consentis, which were these 12 Roman gods. Well, later in Rome's history, we had something very similar. We have a zodiac wheel, and in the center, we put Mithra, which is Sol. And of course, if you remember, we saw that the Sunday word came from di sole, which means that this is just an evolution of Rome's early religion. So this is a solar religion. The Romans deified the planets, and Jupiter/Zeus was their chief god. Baalbec used to be the Greek Heliopolis. How does this all fit? Well, now we're going to try to connect the dots and see, we saw that there's a lot of, suggestion from Bible verses that the Romans might have been worshiping Baal. I mean, if Jupiter or Zeus, if you look at all these different things we've pulled up so far, it's quite likely this was Baal. So we're going to take a look at Baalbec because Baalbec was actually built by the Romans. Baalbec was built by the Romans over top of what the Greeks used to call Heliopolis. So the Greeks worshipped a sun god called Helios. They built an area called Heliopolis. Now we have Baalbec. It's being built right on top. This is Baalbec. And if we take a look at Baalbec, we've got three courts. Three temples, sorry. One temple is called the Temple of Bacchus. It's near the bottom. It's the small temple. On the right-hand side, we see the Temple of Venus. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. The largest temple of Baalbec, which is where Baalbec gets its name, was the Temple of Jupiter. So now we know Jupiter to the Romans was Baal, because of course you wouldn't build an area called Baalbec and then have the head temple be the Temple of Jupiter built by the Romans if the Romans didn't worship Baal. And when you look at all the verses in the Bible that talk about the worship in high places and the worship of Baal, it completely overlaps with the functions that the Romans would perform. The Romans made Baal, Jupiter, their chief god. You see Jupiter in his hand, he's got the lightning bolt. But on the other hand, if you take a look, it's the bursting of the sun. Nowhere in the Bible will you find this object that the Pope is holding. This is called the Pope's monstrance. Compare, what is Jupiter, what is Zeus holding, and what is the Pope's monstrance? They look identical. It's a bursting sun. So an overview of the Roman gods. The Romans had deified the 5 planets that could be seen with the eye, known as the wandering stars, as well as many different natural forces. For example, the hearth. They deified a fireplace. The Romans had a triad of gods that evolved slightly over time, but Jupiter was always the chief. Household gods were called Lars, which were spirits that dwelled over families, so slaves. Each head of the house had a god called a genius. So that was the genius. The genius was pointing towards the father, the head of the house. Genius is pointing towards a very similar idea as a daemon. As a matter of fact, when you study the Greek word daemon and you look at the Roman word genius, a lot of similarity in the dictionary. Each home had a penates, which watched over the valuables. So we have a god that's a household god, we have a god that's the head of the house, we have a god that's over all of your stuff. Each house has a Vesta that watched over the hearth, so that's the god of the fireplace. And then Capitoline Hill, which gets its name from Jupiter, had a triad that was worshipped. So when you hear the word capital, when we just use the word capital, and whether the English language referring to money or refer to like a capital of a place, that word itself implies the worship of Jupiter. That word capital implies that you're worshiping Jupiter. The Roman gods kept evolving as they conquered surrounding nations, where nations would be able to keep their own gods, but they had to accept the authority of the Roman triad. The Romans adopted Greek gods as well as the Sabine gods of former Latium. The Dei Consentis were an arrangement of 6 female and male gods that resembled the zodiac. Like the Canaanites, the Romans worshipped these gods in high places, such as hills. Jupiter was the chief deity of the Pantheon of gods since the beginning of Rome's history. The priests that served the triad were the Flamens, and the chief priest serving Jupiter was the Flamen Dialis. The Pontifex Maximus, which became the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, appointed the Flamen Dialis. The Apostle Peter was not the first Pope, which I mentioned before, unless you specifically mean Christian. Because, of course, Pontifex Maximus existed prior to Peter. We can't say that Augustus was a Pontifex Maximus if Peter was the first Pope. It doesn't work. So now we're continuing on with who is the god Janus. In the first half, we took a look at the religion of Rome. We took a look at when New Year's was in the Bible. New Year's in the Bible was supposed to be the month of Abib or Nisan. We saw that the Romans, the rest of Mesopotamia, they followed that for the longest period of time. And then we saw that it was when all of a sudden the Romans started to inaugurate new consul in 137 BC. That was the first New Year's that was moved to January. So to understand Janus and why they made this move, Janus is a god of gateways. You can see he's got 2 heads, one looking forward and one looking backwards. So when the Romans would invoke Janus, Janus was a god of beginnings and a god of endings. So you'll find quite often with their rituals, before they would call on a god like Jupiter, they would call Janus first. They saw Janus as like this kind of a gatekeeper. So if you imagine heaven above, Janus is the gatekeeper. First you call Janus, Janus opens up the gate, he calls for Jupiter, and then Jupiter responds. So when you look at these different Roman invocations, which I'll show you, they invoke first this god, then they invoke the other gods following. They would actually close their prayers with the Vesta. So Janus would open, that's the male, Vesta would be the closing. So you've got this sandwich of male and female in your prayers. Open with Janus, close with Vesta. So Janus was this god of gates. We can see that if we look at January being the start of the year, we have going forward towards Aries, which is the spring, that's the future, and then going backwards, that's the past. When you look at Janus, you'll find that Janus has 2 heads, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes an old face, sometimes a younger face. And that's denoting the idea of past and future. If you take a look in the Farmer's Almanac, this is farmersalmanac.com. There's an article in January. We already know this from our earlier study, but I just want to confirm it in a few places. Month names and their origins. January, it's the month of Janus, the Roman god of beginning and endings. Janus presided over doors and gates appropriate for the beginning of the year. Indeed, Janus was usually depicted with faces looking forward and backward as a characteristic of the new year. I looked in the Dictionary of Greek Antiquity. I wanted to see from a Greek mindset what they had to say about January. So under Januarius or January, this month was not set down in the old calendar of Romulus. So Romulus had the 10 months, remember? But was brought in by Numa, so the second king, who placed it at the winter solstice in the room where Mars was before, whom Romulus placed at the vernal equinox. So here you can see this is a shift where we're coming from the spring and then switching to the winter. This month was named Januarius in honor of Janus because the Romans had established this god to preside at all beginnings, and that the new year was at this month, or because Janus being represented with two faces, to show by that his singular prudence, which considered both the time past and the time to come, they thought fit to dedicate a month to him, which was the end of the year that was past and the beginning of the year to come. And though the calends or first day of the month was under protection of Juno, like the other first days of the months, yet this was a peculiar manner consecrated to Janus, to whom they offered a day a cake made, a new meal called Janalia, and a new salt. The frankincense and wine presented to him were a new life. This day all the workmen began their works, everyone according to their art and trade, and scholars did the like, being persuaded that having thus begun the year by working, they would be diligent and laborious all the rest of the year. As we learn of Ovid in the first book of his, I can't read that, the consuls appointed for that year took possession on the day of their office and began functions thereof, especially since the emperors and sometime before Rome during the consulship of Quintus Fabius Nobler and Titus Annius Lucius in the year of the foundation of Rome. Wherefore they went up to the Capitol, attended by a great crowd of people, and dressed with new clothes. And there they sacrificed to Jupiter Capitolinus 2 white bulls that were never under a yoke, and spread the perfumes and sweet smells in his temple. The priests called flamens together with the consuls made vows, while the sacrifice was performing, for the prosperity of the empire, and the safety of the emperors, having first taken the oath of allegiance and ratified all that they have done the foregoing year. Likewise, the other magistrates and the people made the same vows and took the oath. And Tacitus tells us in the 16th book of Annals that Trapius, impeached of purposely absented himself from the assemblies where the magistrates took the solemn oath and vows were made for the safety of the emperor. Okay, so that's the dictionary definition of January from the Dictionary of Greek Antiquity. Just to summarize what we read there, it said that January receives its name from the Roman god Janus. This we know. Janus was the god of beginning and endings, the god of gates. New Roman consuls took office in January 153 BC. So this was the first new year, 153 BC, in January, because before they were doing March. When the inauguration of consuls changed from January, so was the new year. Romans would bake cakes called Janilius and presented drink offerings. Tradesmen would start their plans of labor for the year. People would go to the Capitol where Jupiter was worshipped, dressed in new clothes, and they would sacrifice 2 white bulls that were never under a yoke to Jupiter Capitolinus and lit incense in the temple. While the sacrifice was being performed, the flamens would be performing a ritual for the prosperity of Rome. Okay, so let's do a little bit of comparison here. So here's the Janus coin, Roman Republic. Here's the Janus temple coin. And of course, the Janus temple was built by King Pompilius. So this is right in the early stages of Rome. Janus was a god with 2 faces, and you would see him holding a key. So the key represented the key to heaven. What we're looking at is the idea of a gold key and a silver key. Gold being the key to heaven, silver being the kingdom of hell. So Janus had a key to both worlds. Sometimes they would only show him, though, with the 1 key. The other key, the silver key, if you think about it, at the Vatican's symbol is the crown, which is the triple crown. And behind the triple crown, you'll find the keys of St. Peter. It's the gold key,
and the silver key, just like Janus would hold. Here's some different illustrations of Janus. Sometimes you would see the same face looking forward and back. Sometimes it would be a male, sometimes female. Sometimes you would see older, sometimes you would see younger. On the left-hand side, we can see Janus with belladonna. On the right-hand side, we can see Janus as a male and a female. So here we can see the nature god. We can see the horn god. The Greeks had a horn god called Pan. The Celts had a god called Cernunnos. That's exactly who we're seeing here on the backside of this goddess. So this also represented Janus. What we're actually looking at is the sun and the moon. Janus has the horns, which represent the moon, and the goddess was beautiful, which represented the sun. So here's the duality we saw later in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, when you had the alchemists, the guys that are trying to turn lead into gold, you can see that the symbol of Janus got changed into an androgynous figure that was two-headed holding the sun and the moon. It's the same thing. So look at the progression. If first off, we start off with Roman Empire, we see this two-headed king-queen with bat wings and a sword and a crown, and then standing on top of a serpent. We see later images that are very similar, but then during the Renaissance period with the alchemists, it really starts to look different. We can see here the male and the female, but now instead we see rebus and we see a compass and we see a square. Well, a compass draws a circle and a square, builder square, draws a square. So the square represented the female. Slang for the female, when we talk about female, we could say a box, that's slang. The box was associated to the square, and then the male was associated to the circle. So one was associated to sun, one moon, one male, one female, one circle, one square. This is how it kept translating. Janus then started to look like a double-headed bird. So we have the Holy Roman Empire, the two-headed bird. Well, this would be Janus. And then if we take a look, we can see the Byzantine Empire. Now, just to confirm that this is actually Janus, look at the objects being held in the hands of the bird. Look at what was in the hands of Janus. It is the exact same symbol. What you have is you have people trying to hide symbols and keep it within the priesthood so you don't understand what they mean. But if you look at the symbols between these images, you can see that they just started to change things, but they were actually showing the same symbol. As a matter of fact, if you look behind the head of the two birds on the Holy Roman Empire on the left, you can see two suns. These are two solar spheres. The evolution continued. The double-headed bird went across Europe and eventually turned into a single-headed bird, and eventually into the single-headed eagle. If you study Hitler, you'll find that Hitler was trying to figure out the secrets of masonry. He was trying to figure out the secrets of the mysteries of the ancient world, and he was going through books on the Aryans, books on masonry, trying to understand the secrets of the past. That's why you can see the same symbols showing up with the Roman Catholics as you can with the Masons, as you can with Hitler. And the reason why is because the Masons built the cathedrals for the Catholics. So the Masons put their symbols inside of the cathedrals, and the symbols that were inside the cathedrals were symbols that were associated to their religion, which came from Persia. So really, when you're looking at the American eagle, remember the American eagle, the whole American dollar was designed by Freemasons, and they put Egyptian symbolism on there. So then this god must have been worshipped before Rome, going all the way back to Egypt. And that would make sense because, of course, when we take a look at the evolution of this god, we notice that the god actually traveled through areas such as Phoenicia before coming into the hands of the Romans. And here we can see this double-headed eagle. You notice in one hand, it's got the arrows, in the other hand, it's got the wreaths. It's the exact same thing you saw with Janus. How do you know? Well, because the wreaths, you see those with the United Nations. What does it represent? Diplomacy, right? When a bunch of leaders come together and they talk, that's diplomacy. So that's one half of Janus. The other half is the war half. So remember, Janus had the doors closed when there was peace. That's the left-hand side. Janus had the doors open when there was war. That's the right-hand side. We're just looking at the evolution of a symbol over thousands of years. So it should start to make sense how the worship of Baal, the sun, made its way into North America, looking at symbolism and history. One half of Janus is the Queen of Heaven. On the far left, we can clearly see that's Janus with the male and the female head. Notice how he's stepping on top of the crescent moon. Instead of showing a two-headed Mary, what they did was they showed Mary holding a child, which represented the goddess of the earth, and then her offspring, which was a tree, the nature god, Tammuz. So when we're looking at Janus, what you're really looking at is a religion of the worship of Mother Nature. And that shouldn't be surprising, considering that all the festivals that the Romans participated in were based on the solstices and equinoxes and places where things were in the sky and having to do with the veneration of natural forces on the ground. So this is not the worship of God, this is the worship of the creation. So New Year's is associated to the worship of the creation. In Jeremiah 7:18, it says, "The children gather wood, the fathers light fire, and the women knead dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to arouse my anger." So in Jeremiah, they weren't just worshiping the Queen of Heaven. The Queen of Heaven was worshipped alongside other gods. We saw the same thing in Rome. Jeremiah 44:15. "When all the men who knew what their wives were burning incense to other gods, along with all the women who were present, a large assembly, and all the people living in Lower and Upper Egypt said to Jeremiah." Okay, so here we can see they poured out drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven as well as other gods. They made cakes to the Queen of Heaven as well as other gods, and they burned incense to other gods. Now look what it says in the Dictionary of Greek Antiquity under January, which we just read. Romans would bake cakes called janulus and presented drink offerings. Well, that sounds a lot like Jeremiah. The only difference here is in Jeremiah, we're dealing with a female, but here when we're looking at this Janus character, Janus is a male. But what do we notice about Janus? Janus is a male/female. He's both. Because remember, when we're dealing with nature, we've got winter, we've got summer, we've got sun, we've got moon, we've got the male Janus, we've got the female Janus. So in other words, when the part of the year was favorable, the favorable part of the year was represented by a goddess. When the year was unfavorable and cold, it was represented by a harsh horned god. People would go to the capital where Jupiter was worshipped dressed in new clothes, as they would sacrifice 2 white bulls that were never under a yoke to Jupiter Capitolinus and lit incense in the temple. Now, looking at this line right here, if you can see that the celebration of New Year's involved what? Sacrifices to Jupiter. Well, this should really bother a Christian because Jupiter is Satan. So if every New Year's, what would happen is they would call upon Janus. Janus would open up the gateway of heaven. They would do that in the town square. All the people would come out in front of the obelisk because that was the ritual site. How is that any different from today? The only thing that you're not noticing is the Jupiter part, but everything else you're going to see is very much the same. So let's look at the connections here. Wasn't the Queen of Heaven from Egypt? How can we say that the Queen of Heaven is being represented in Rome when the Queen of Heaven was an Egyptian god? In this titled The Stubbornness of the People, Jeremiah 44:15, notice the highlight, along with the people living in the land of Egypt. So where was the Queen of Heaven coming from? We've studied this before. The Queen of Heaven was from Egypt. This was a goddess from Egypt, but she didn't just reside in Egypt. As the religion of Babylon spread across the Middle East and the Orient, you saw the Queen of Heaven go under many different names. Cybele. In Greece, Cybele was met with a mixed reception. She became partially assimilated to the aspects of the earth goddess Gaia. So anyone's ever heard of Gaia, Mother Earth? This is who Cybele is. Of her possibly Minoan equivalent Rhea, and of the harvest mother goddess Demeter. In Rome, Cybele became known as Magna Mater, in other words, the Great Mother. This is where the Mother Earth worship was coming from. The Roman state adopted and developed a particular form of her cult after the Cybelean oracle in 205 BC recommended her conscription as a key religious ally in Rome's second war against Carthage. Okay, so who's Carthage? In the Bible, Carthage are the Canaanites. Carthage is North Africa, and Phoenicia, which are the Canaanites, extended into North Africa. The Romans realized, or they felt, that they wouldn't be able to defeat the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, unless they were to adopt one of their gods. So the worship of Cybele actually came from Phoenicia, Carthage, and was brought into Rome as a method for them to win their war. So if you notice, it says Rome's second war against Carthage. There were 3 wars against Carthage. They were called the 3 Punic Wars. The third Punic War was won after the Romans took the statue of Cybele and brought it into Rome. Cybele was brought to Rome from Carthage to win the Punic Wars. So Cybele is not a Roman deity. She is actually a deity that came from Phoenicia, and Phoenicia are the Canaanites in the Bible. So if we take a look in the Wikipedia, Queen of Heaven in antiquity, it lists off a whole bunch of different names for her. It says she was known as Ishtar, Dinger Ma. Cybele is the one that I wanted to focus on. So if we look at Cybele, Cybele is what she was in Rome. She came from Phoenicia. If we take a look here, Queen of Heaven, identified as Cybele. Here's another site. It's called God Medus. Cybele is none other than the Queen of Heaven. So this is important. The reason why this is important, because now we're seeing an overlap between things that are going on in Rome, at least ancient Rome, and New Year's, and the Queen of Heaven. So one half of Janus is the Queen of Heaven. When you don't see the male side, you're just seeing the Queen of Heaven. So when you take a look at the astrological wheel, which this is all based on, remember, at the winter solstice, which is when the New Year is happening, there were two zodiac signs that overlapped. Sagittarius and Capricorn, or Janus and Juno, or male and female. Capricorn is the goat. Now we can see where the goat's coming from. There's a hymn. It's called the Salient Hymn to Janus. I got this from JSTOR. This is by George Hempel. So here's the piece in Latin. Translated, it says, "Come forth with the cuckoo. Truly all things dost thou make open. Thou art Janus Curtius, the good creator art thou. Good Janus is coming, the chief of superior rulers." So they had deified Janus as if he was a creator god. But notice here that it's talking about the spring. It thus appears that we have three lines, not necessarily consecutive, of the hymn of the Salian priests sang to Janus. When armed and bearing the Ancilia, they marched with songs and dances about the city at sacred place during the month of March. So you can see Janus was invoked in March during the New Year, and then later in 137 BC, Janus was invoked in January when they moved it with the inauguration of the council. This is just the time when the cuckoo passes over the Mediterranean from Africa to Europe and is universally hailed as the harbinger of spring. So in the Mediterranean, when you would see the cuckoo fly, you knew that summer was, or spring was close, or summer was near. So the ancient Italian deity Janus, who opens up all things, who causes the spring to flow and the seed to germinate, Ceres, the benign creator, is invited to come with the cuckoo and usher in the spring. So you would actually see Janus a couple times throughout the year. Janus would show up on the solstice and equinox. So you would see it in January. Then that was when they moved it. That would be the beginning of the year. But then when they used to look at the beginning of spring being the beginning of the year, Janus would appear at the beginning of spring because Janus would open the door and then comes the spring. And then in the fall was when the military campaign ended. And so you would see Janus in the fall as well. And so you would see Janus showing the opening of the military campaign, the closing of the military campaign, because obviously it's not a good idea to fight during the winter. And then you would see Janus opening the spring, Janus opening the summer, and Janus opening the new year. So Janus was invoked, as you can see, constantly whenever they were shifting from one thing to another, whether it be the seasons or gods or council leaders. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII declared the Gregorian calendar, which is widely used today. The Gregorian calendar reform also in effect established January 1st as New Year's Day. Although most Catholic countries adopted the Gregorian calendar almost immediately, it was almost gradually adopted by Protestant countries. The calendar that we have today in some places, such as Turkey, wasn't actually adopted until 1923. Turks were using a totally different calendar than the Gregorian calendar until the 1920s. The British didn't adopt the calendar we have today until the 1700s. Even though they had put this into place in the 1500s, most Protestants thought that the Catholics at the time were trying to conduct some kind of a magical spell and steal days of their lives away. It actually caused rioting and protests. Most of the nations, or most of Western Europe, officially adopted January 1st as New Year's Day, somewhat before they adopted the Gregorian calendar. So people were more comfortable with adopting January 1st as the New Year in Europe than they were adopting the Gregorian calendar, which tells you that across Europe, there were areas that still didn't acknowledge January as the New Year. That means they were still looking at March as the New Year. If you take a look at encyclopedia.com under Gods of the Roman Empire, it says, when a long list of deities was invoked in a prayer, Janus was called on first, even before Jupiter. And I explain why. You have to open the door first, let the god out. Because of the later poetic inventions, it came to be believed that Janus was the first principal god of the Romans and was later superseded by Jupiter, but this is not so. As Varro put it, the first things are in Janus's power, the highest things in Jupiter's. So in other words, since Janus has to open the door, that's why he was seen as being the first. He wasn't actually the chief god. He was just the one that let the chief god through. So Janus had the first line of power, but he didn't have the supreme power that Jupiter had. The two work together. So Janus was invoked to open the door way to heaven and call which other god was being served. So if you're calling Mercury, you would call Janus first, then you would invoke Mercury. If you're calling Mars, you invoke Janus, then you invoke Mars, and you would close it with Vesta. Any rite or religious act, whatever, first required the invocation of Janus, a corresponding invocation to Vesta at the end, Janus Primus and Vesta Extrema. Instances are to be found in the Carmen Celeria, which we just took a look at, the Formula of Devotio, and the Lucria of the Fields of the Sacrifices of Porca, I can't pronounce that, and Acta of Avril Brethren. The relationship between Janus and Juno is defined by the closeness of the notions of the beginning and transition of the functions of conception and delivery, result of youth and vital force. As soon as I saw those words youth and vital force, I know this from the pagan world, where you have this idea of the male energy and the female energy. So for example, if we're talking Hinduism, it's called the Pingala on one side. The Pingala would be the male force. So we've got these two opposing energies. As soon as I saw this, I'm like, this Janus character is actually just a very modern version of the yin and yang. The Roman religion is based on the worship of nature and the planets. Well, with that in mind, it should make a lot of sense now that they're looking at things that are involving the creation. This is nature worship. So when you look at any religion that has the sun and the moon being portrayed through symbols, you're dealing with a religion that's worshiping the creation. So the Roman religion is the worship of creation, nature and the planets. So really, what is the Roman religion? It's more of the yin and yang. It's an Oriental religion. The Romans took Oriental gods. So when we take a look at Janus, and then we take a look at what happened later in Europe around the 1500s, we see the Renaissance period with the alchemists, and the alchemists' god is clearly the same thing as Janus. So the Romans obviously serve Baal as Jupiter, and Jupiter is identified as Satan in Revelation 13. This is why these holy days give me like a really awkward feeling. As soon as I see that January is based on Janus and it conflicts with the Bible, and all of a sudden we're invoking some god Janus to call Satan, which is Jupiter, obviously I'm extremely uncomfortable with this holy day. There's no way you can disconnect this from the worship of who the Christians call Satan. It's just a matter of, what does that mean? So when you take a look at this image here, you'll see on New Year's quite often what happens. Well, we have a countdown and then there's a ball that drops. Well, the reason why is this. Now that you understand where New Year's comes from, it's associated to Janus, and then Janus would invoke Jupiter at the beginning of the year with some sacrifices. What do you think the ball actually represents? The ball represents the sun. Since Baal is a sun god and Jupiter is a sun god, and we're looking at the winter solstice, when you watch the ball come down, what you're seeing is the sun drop down through the gateway of Janus after the winter solstice. So in other words, when you watch in the winter on December the 21st, the sun dies on the horizon, and then the sun shoots back up again. So when you're standing there on New Year's and you're watching the ball drop, you're all watching the sun go down, reach its lowest point during the solstice, and then at 1, that's when it hits the bottom. That's because now we're going to celebrate the sun going back up into the sky again, and we're all going to be warm for the summer. So look at the left-hand side and look at the right. The ball is going down. What you're seeing is December the 21st, where the sun touches down on the horizon. These are the motions of the sun during the solstice. You cannot separate the New Year from sun worship. It's obvious. Augustus closing the Temple of Janus. So remember, we discussed that Augustus, so he was a Pontifex Maximus, he was a pope, okay? He closed the Temple of Janus, and he closed it with the founding of the Roman Empire in 27 BC, where he became the first Caesar. But if you look behind, what do you see? Behind the Temple of Janus, right in that open window, we can see an obelisk. And it's not just any obelisk, it's an Egyptian obelisk. We can see the Egyptian hieroglyphics right on it. So to say that the Romans not being influenced by the Egyptians, that's ridiculous. You can see the Egyptian symbolism behind them. And just like we're connecting dots with all these different gods, you can definitely connect the Egyptian gods. Keep in mind, remember that we just learned they took the goddess Cybele and they brought Cybele into Rome. Well, Cybele is the queen of heaven, which is the Egyptian Isis. So here's Edmonton. When we celebrate New Year's in Edmonton, this is where you go. There is an appointed spot where you're supposed to go to watch the fireworks, because otherwise you won't be near the fireworks. They always set up the fireworks where you'll find the obelisk. So if you take a look here in front of the waters, here's the obelisk, the standing stone. Behind it, we can see a pyramid, just like Egypt. Now we're going to go to the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. So again, when the rituals occur, when the fireworks go off, where do you go? You go to the ritual area. The ritual area is where the standing stone is. The standing stone is, again, the obelisk. Here's Washington, D.C. Again, New Year's, where do you go? You go to where the standing stone is. You go to where the obelisk is. You go where the big square is. There's always a square, because when magic is being performed, it has to be done on a square. The Masons do their magic on a square, witches do their magic on a circle, and the military march on a parade square when they do their formations. And there was a strong connection between the Roman god Mars, the god of war, and the military. If you take a look here, we can see again, obelisk and then the fireworks. You have to come to the obelisk to see the fireworks. What is this all about? Well, let's go back to Egypt, because this is where it comes from. If we take a look, we can see there's a male god that's laying on the ground and a female goddess that's curved above him, and then someone standing in the center. Now, I'm pretty sure the one in the center is Shu. He's the one that's holding up the sky. The Greeks would have called him the god Atlas. He represents moisture in the air. Above him is Nut. Nut is covered with the stars of the sky. Later, she was called Isis, the queen of heaven. You can see why she's the queen of heaven, because she's literally the personification of the sky. Below the personification of the sky, known as the queen of heaven or Isis or Nut, we've got Geb, and Geb is laying on the ground. Now you're like, well, what does this have to do with the obelisk and the fireworks? Look at this image. Notice in this image, Geb is laying on the ground and he has an erect phallus, and the erect phallus is pointing towards the sky. These Egyptian obelisks are actually the phallus of Geb. They are the phallus of the ground god. Every time you walk in front of a parliament building, some government building, and you see this symbol goes back thousands of years, and it represents the phallus. And so what's going on New Year's? Remember, if we're talking about sun worship and Baal, and we're talking about nature and natural things that occur, when you're looking at the obelisk and the fireworks are behind it, that is the ejaculation. Everyone is standing and waiting, and they are counting down until the heaven and the earth come together when they do their ritual. This is a representation of the impregnation of the fertility between winter and summer. So in other words, once Geb ejaculates, guess what's coming? The spring. We're celebrating the coming of the spring at January. Each year we go to the town square and we observe the fertility ritual between the sky and the ground. So if we take a look, remember we saw that double-headed Janus. Well, double-headed Janus, we said that the side with the horns represented the moon, and the moon represented the side of nature. The goddess represented the side of the sun. So the back side with the horns, that's the lunar god. The front side, that's the solar goddess. And when we looked at images of Janus in the Renaissance, we saw Janus had both the sun and moon in his hands. Well, now we understand who Janus really is. Since we can see there's a connection to solar worship, and we can see that within Masonry, a lot of the cathedrals were built for the Catholics, we can start to understand why we found these symbols there. When we look at the Baphomet is both male and female. So if the Baphomet is male and female, that would mean that the Baphomet is Janus, because the horn god we can clearly see, that's the male aspect. The female aspect, that's the solar piece. So on top of Baphomet's head, look, you'll notice that there is a flame, there is a candle, there is fire. And the reason why is because that represents the goddess, that's the sun, the other part's the moon. As a matter of fact, if I was to go back to Egypt, I'll quickly pull this up. Let's look at the goddess Hathor, because you're going to see it right away. Even Isis has it. Look on top of her head. You've got the horns, and then you've got the sun. And you go back to the Baphomet. again, it's a little more stealthy. We've got the horns, and right here, there's the sun. So Walt Disney, again, another Freemason, we can see he branded this as, instead of Janus, Beauty and the Beast. Every child that's watched Beauty and the Beast is actually watching Janus. So again, this goes right back to New Year's. What was the name of the character in Beauty and the Beast? Well, Bel. Bel was the main character. Bel, well, wasn't the sun god called Baal? So the question is it a sun god or sun goddess? Well, we've already defined it. We said that the god was the one with the horns. He was the moon god, which means that the goddess, well, that would be the only one that's left. She's the sun goddess. He's the moon god. So Bel is the sun. Bel is the feminine name of Baal. So Baal can be worshipped as a male, but Baal can also be worshipped as a female. So one half of Janus is the Queen of Heaven. In other words, the Mary that we see in these pictures, yes, there was a Mary, Mother of Christ, but the Mary in these pictures drawn by these artists, this is the sun and the moon. So we're talking about Janus. When we see Mary by herself, we're seeing Bel. We're seeing the feminine version of Baal. When we're seeing Mary with the child, we're seeing the horn god Janus on the other side. As a matter of fact, to prove it, I would have to be able to show you one picture of Mary holding a child with devil horns to prove to you that, in fact, Janus is the same character as what we're looking at here. So let's find it. All I have to do is type in Virgin Mary. Right here. So you'll find that there's a church in Italy, in Milan, and you'll find Mary holding a child that has devil horns on top of their head. It makes absolutely no sense unless you know the history of Janus. So now if we take a look at the Vatican's website, perhaps they have something to explain in regards to, are we actually looking at Janus? Is there something that they might give us a clue in regards to how maybe Janus got blended together with the Virgin Mary? This is called On Proclaiming the Queenship of Mary. This is from 1954. Venerable brethren, health and apostolic blessing. From the earliest ages of the Catholic Church, a Christian people, whether in the time of triumph or more especially in the time of crisis, has addressed prayers of petition and hymns of praise and veneration to the Queen of Heaven. Excuse me? I looked in the book of Jeremiah. We looked there together. I don't recall that we're supposed to be giving hymns of prayer and petition to the Queen of Heaven. That's Isis, that's Cybele. And then it says, and never has that hope wavered, which they have placed in the mother of the divine King, Jesus Christ. Nor has that faith ever failed, by which we are taught that Mary, the Virgin Mother of God, reigns with a mother solicitude over the entire world, just as she crowned in heavenly blessedness with the glory of a queen. So they have associated the Queen of Heaven to Mary, the Mother of God. The problem, though, is if you read the Bible and you look at Jeremiah, Jeremiah is the only place where that word Queen of Heaven shows up. And the only thing we're taught about the Queen of Heaven is that she's an Egyptian goddess, and they would bake cakes to her. And we've located that Egyptian goddess, and we've located her as Isis. So what they're doing here is, you can see the Vatican is blending together Isis with the Queen of Heaven. And that shouldn't surprise you for two reasons. One, Jupiter was the chief god. And secondly, we can see that in Rome, they had this cult of the Mega Mater, which was the cult of the Mother Goddess. So if you have a cult of the Mother Goddess and you have a solar cult, which is a sky god, that means that at Rome, in the exact same time that Christians are trying to push forward this idea of the Gospels, what are we seeing? We're seeing a sky father called Jupiter. That's competition. That's a sun god. That's Baal. And then we have a ground goddess called Cybele, or Meg Mater, which is the Great Mother. So there are two religions in Rome at the same time competing for followers, and there's obviously leaders that are more associated to the worship of a goddess, and some that are associated to the worship of God. As a matter of fact, when we were studying, we saw that Hadrian, he was the one that built Baalbek, so that was the Temple of Jupiter, and we saw someone else build the Temple of Venus. So we can see that these god and goddess archetypes in Rome, they were constantly worshipped, and it looks like what happened as we reach the present age. What happened was Christianity is in a situation where they've been blended together. You'll find on the Catholic side of the fence, there's more blending together with the god, with the goddess, so the ground mother. On the Protestant side of the fence, you'll find that there's more gravitation towards the sky god. So what you'll find is the Jews started worshiping the sun, the Romans started worshiping the sun, and that's why you start to see the similar symbols of a triangle with an all-seeing eye in both Masonry and in Catholic churches. If Mary has been associated to the Queen of Heaven, which was a god of Egypt, need I say more? Unless we can agree that we're supposed to worship the Queen of Heaven and the Queen of Heaven is God's wife or has some kind of a role that's listed in the Bible, we should have nothing to do with her, because everyone who has worshipped the Queen of Heaven in the past has fallen prey to illness, to ailment, to war, warnings from prophets. It always worked out in a bad fashion. So in the future, if we find that New Year's is associated to Jupiter, because of course they started off doing sacrifices to Jupiter, and we said that Jupiter is Satan because that's the god of Pergamum. Well, then what we're dealing with here when we see the Magna Mater and we see Jupiter, we're seeing this thing we saw in the ancient world that was called Baal and his Asherah. In the Old Testament, you'll find Baal and his Asherah. Baal was always seen with a goddess. Throughout the whole Old Testament, any times that they were smashing these these high places that were made to Baal, they were also destroying the groves and the idols that were associated to Asherah. The two were always seen together. It looks like what happened in our modern history, instead of seeing Baal and Asherah together, right now what I'm seeing is in Judaism, I'm seeing a lot of the worship of Baal. And then if I take a look at Roman Catholicism, I'm seeing the worship of Asherah, and the two of them are fighting with each other, and Protestants and Catholics are just picking sides between the two of them, and they're being confused by both sides. There is no correct path. Both paths are tainted because both paths are pointing back to the sky or the ground. And the God in the Bible has nothing to do with the creation. He is not the sun, the moon, the stars, or the host of heaven. So this is all the sneaky solar worship of Rome. It's not very in your face. Remember, when you read the Bible, what does it tell you about the serpent? It tells you that the serpent was the most subtle beast of the field. Now, when we put all these details together and we look at New Year's and Christmas and the gods of Rome, you can see it. But of course, you have to go through a lot of details to recognize that it looks like on one side of the fence, people were trying to overlap Christ with the sun. And on the other side of the fence, people are trying to take the Queen of Heaven, or Mary, and they're making Mary into this Egyptian goddess that's called Cybele. Very sneaky.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.